That I've often thought about, but I've never really had a good read on, to be perfectly honest, even though I've presented on this topic numerous times, is this phenomenon of people who produce something called manga, who are not themselves Japanese, who do not write in Japanese, who may not even speak Japanese, and yet nonetheless produce this thing that they call manga. Sometimes it's referred to as OEL, or original English language manga. Sometimes it's referred to simply as non-Japanese because it's not always written in English. Sometimes it's French, sometimes it's German, sometimes it's Spanish, sometimes it's Chinese, sometimes it's Korean, sometimes it's any of a bazillion things, but they still tend to call it manga. And now this is particularly weird in the Anglo-American context because, well, why wouldn't they just call them comics? I mean, think about it. No, I mean seriously, think about this. If you're making something that, it's in panels, it has sort of cartoonish-y figures, they engage in dialogue, they have speech balloons and so forth, and you arrange them on a page. You may use screen tones, and they may have like pointy chins and grotesquely elongated anatomy, but still, why wouldn't you call it a comic? Think about it for a sec. Why would you not call that a comic? Why would you call it manga? Well, I've had various takes on this in the past. I'm not going to reproduce them here because I don't necessarily think any of them are right. So my latest revision of an explanation for this phenomenon has to do with kind of, what should I call this, a community of reading. Sorry, a form of reading that develops out of a particular life experience. Something that I only recently factored into this sort of complex of observations is the fact that my tea, by the way, I'm drinking green tea. It's very good. Anyway, something that I only recently factored into this complex of observations is that, how should I put this? Well, okay, so there's clearly an overlap between people who read Japanese comics and who read Anglo-American comics, and perhaps, a lesser extent, Franco-Belgian, Mexican, Spanish, etc., etc., etc. But to construct an unnecessary polarity, there's a very clear overlap between people who read comics and people who read manga. To use this word that I don't particularly like, but whatever. So there's that gooey bit in the middle. So this part right here, where they overlap. And yet, what's also interesting is that there's a huge group over here who read comics, but don't read any manga at all. And there's also a very large group over here that read manga and yet don't read any Anglo-American comics at all. My wife is actually a really good example of this. She rests fairly firmly in this group, although probably more at the border, because she did read Archie growing up, which is very clearly an American comic. But what's different is that there's a very different sort of experience of reading represented by these groups. Not the one in the middle that represents my head. My head is apparently the overlap in this example. I know, it's very bad. So this group over here has a very different experience of sort of a community of readers than this group. Why is that? Well, there are a lot of important things you need to know about the demographics of these two groups. This one is overwhelmingly male. Overwhelmingly. Sure, there are women, young girls, teenage girls, whatever, who read Anglo-American comics. I wouldn't deny that. However, the ratio of those young ladies to masculine types, male types, masculine is not a good word, male types, the men obviously predominate. Whereas in this group, what's interesting is that, and this is mostly true in the American context, I don't mean to speak for our friends in France or Deutschland and so forth. In the American context, there have been times in which this group over here has been overwhelmingly female. Now, I think it would be too easy to make an argument that, and this is an argument that actually is often made, especially by those who translate and publish comics in the manga in the US. is that the reason why manga became so popular so quickly, because really it took less than a decade for manga to basically explode in the US, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. The argument they often make for why manga exploded so much is that it was a kind of comic text that appealed to, or at least accounted for, a group of readers who were not previously accounted for. And I think there actually is some truth in that, especially if you look at it in terms of gender. Now, I'm not trying to say that comics naturally alienate young women, but especially if you look at superhero comics from, you know, the 80s on, women are rather, well, let's just admit this, gentlemen, grossly objectified, whereas women, or girls, women, female types of any sort, in manga are objectified in, well, different ways, in ways that may not necessarily be readily apparent to a casual Western observer. Anyway, like I said, I don't want to read too much into that, but the thing is, what that means is that there are very clear signs that these two groups have a very different experience reading comics. And so, the desire on the part of people from this group, when they start making their own comics, to call them manga, is not necessarily a form of antagonism. In other words, it's not to say that it's like, you know, these are manga, not comics, comics are shit, manga is amazing, whereas over here you have people say, the comics are amazing, manga is shit. No, I don't actually think that's what it is at all. I mean, I think that's too facile a way of understanding this, but rather it's a way of saying, this is the experience of reading this particular form of graphic literature that I come from, and that I see myself and the thing that I produce as an artist and as a reader, because those two things really do overlap in this instance, is representative of manga, the thing that I read coming up as sort of a reader of a particular kind of graphic literature. And so it's a way of constructing yourself as a reader, as an artist, as a reader, and also of sort of rendering yourself as part of a community, because I mean, there are comic book conventions, and there are anime and manga conventions, and the two really don't overlap all that much. In fact, they overlap very little. There may be organizers who are, as I said, you know, there are people in this area here who may go back and forth between the two, but in terms of their structure, sort of institutional practices, and what they recognize as being part of their, you know, respective fields, for lack of a better term, not really much overlap. And so, yeah, I mean, in the past I have actually referred to these people here and the comics that they sometimes create as a form of exoticism, cultural barbarism. Probably taking things a little too far. But I did actually believe that, and I think it is kind of true. There is often a little bit of exoticizing of Japanese culture in the non-Japanese manga that you see, but not always. Not always.